Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, and I am your host, Chris Angle. Along with me are my co-hosts, Remy Canario and Rick Samuelson. Remy is a political analyst out of Washington, D.C., and Rick is a venture capitalist on the West Coast. Good to see you guys.
Hi, Chris.
Each week, the Philosophical Angle takes a concept out of current media and analyzes the nature and essence of it and how it's being used in current media. So this week, it's going to be the speech by President Hollande and the extraction or the editing from the speech of the words Islamic terrorism. So let's get started. This editing, as we just mentioned, was a speech given by President Hollande, and let's take a look at that. And the meeting here, it says the meeting was part of the Nuclear Security Summit of over 50 world leaders, and the 8-minute video had the reference edited out, but at a little over halfway, Hollande is heard saying in French, the roots of terrorism, Islamic terrorism, is in Syria and in Iraq. And the White House video omitted the audio English translation of the words Islamic terrorism at that point. And this is from reporting by Mr. Berkowitz. And so let's discuss this. So obviously, within the administration, there's a priority to eliminate any communication between the relationship between Islam and terrorism. And so there is either a preference to protect the terrorism, the concept of terrorism, or it's the concept of Islam. Well, probably it's a preference for Islam, and that's within the protection of the administration. And so you got to ask, why is that? And so let's call it. So the left believes that Muslims have been the victims of white, Western, Christian, Judeo unfairness. And this unfairness comes from the exploitation of the behavior of this class of people when they come into contact with others, out of which they make a profit. So when a businessman has a business dealing and he comes into contact with others, and when leaving, these people make a profit, and in this becoming well-to-do, and the other party, they tend to call the victims with whom they're dealing, and they don't come away with a profit, and the left believes that this exploitation is akin to stealing, and as one of the exploited classes, the Muslims, or any other class that comes into the contact with these people, they are entitled to compensation and assistance. And one form of assistance here is to not blame them for one of their natural reactions to this situation, which is to violently react to the white, Western, Christian, Judeo class that caused them to exploit and be terrorized, or to be exploited and in the first place. So they conclude, the left that is, that terrorism is a natural human reaction to dealing with the white, Western, Christian, Judeo class, and as such there would be other groups that would have been downtrodden by this class, and thus terrorism is not generated by Muslims or Islam, but could be generated by others. And there is no particular relationship between terror and Islam. It could be terror generated by any other unfortunate group that comes into dealing with these class of people that make a profit, and thus it's a natural reaction. So, but in pragmatically, we take a look at the history of Islam and its relationship with the West, and we see over the last 15 years that there have been over 28,000 acts of terror by Muslims since 9/11. And I took this fact from the website called the religionofpeace.com. And if we examine the actual statements of Muslims and particularly the terrorists, they denote in their videos and in their communiques passages from the Quran and the Hadith, which is collectively known as the Sunnah, and some passages that I'm just going to give you that they'll point to are such things like the Quran, Surah 5, verse 33. The punishment of those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive to make mischief in the land is only this, that they should be murdered or crucified, for their hands and their feet should be cut off on opposite sides, or they should be imprisoned. This shall be as a disgrace for them in this world and in the hereafter. They shall have a grievous chastisement. And with the actual and the methodology of producing terror also has Islamic roots in the Quran in Surah 8, verse 12. I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. Therefore strike off their heads and strike off every fingertip of them. And so when a terrorist, they want to cause pain also, and they reach to the Quran and they find Surah 4, verse 104. And be not weak-hearted in pursuit of the enemy. If you suffer pain, then surely they too suffer pain as you suffer pain. And there is an incentive to fight. And as noted in Surah 8, verse 39, and fight we with them until there is no more fitna, which is really unbelief. And religion should only be for Allah. And we're going to also quote 8:65. O Prophet, exhort the believers to fight. So also in terrorism, they need to cause fear, and so the terrorist will reach into the Quran to find justification for their actions, and they reach to Surah 8, verse 57. If thou comest on them in the war, deal with them so as to strike fear in those who are behind them, that haply they may remember. So there's a clear I feel connection between Islam, terror, and the Quran. And I think political correctness tends to step in, as we have seen here in this editing of the speech by Hollande, and it's trying to avoid the reality of the situation. Guys, what do you think? Remy, why don't you go first?
Sure. Now, I would strongly dispute your characterization of the thinking on the left as having something to do with an extractive exploitation, justifying any acts of terror. I do understand where you're coming from with that. However, if you think about it, I do agree with the premise that being a downtrodden people, being marginalized, being a feeling as though you're not in charge of your country, you don't have a stake, is a driver of terrorism. And one of the reasons why I do believe that that's the case is that it is just simply a fact that in this day and age, right-wing terrorism of the same that comes from the same source as many of the more extreme fringes of the Tea Party and such, is a bigger source of death in the United States than radical Islamic terrorism is. So I believe it's the same ingredients that are responsible for that being the case. It certainly isn't unique to Islam, although they certainly in the Middle East have developed a culture within those countries, and I see this as more of a sociological than a theological problem of committing acts of terrorism. But that is precisely the reason why I do believe that we should avoid putting the words terrorism and Islam in the same sentence, because it is precisely the relative welfare and the relative acceptance of the most Muslim community in this country that prevents them from being prey to the same marginalization that you have in the Islamic countries themselves and in much of Europe that is leading directly to terrorism. I mean, it is not Syrian refugees who are behind these terror cells that are causing so much havoc in Europe right now. It is the nationals themselves or long-term immigrants. And so if there is any potential cost to putting those two words into the same sentence, and I believe there is, I mean, the propaganda kind of writes itself. You just, one little mistranslation, and all of a sudden you have the American president saying exactly what a young person who's about to be radicalized needs to hear in order to push him over the edge. If that were to happen one time, it's too big of a cost because there simply is no benefit. There is no benefit to saying this expression when we all understand what's going on. We all understand. It's no one's blind to it, and I do not understand what the opposition is. What we're going to the president's going to say radical Islamic terrorism, and then we win? Is that what we've been missing this whole time? It seems absolutely absurd that this cost-benefit analysis simply isn't run. I mean, the cost of alienating our Muslim fellow citizens is just too high. And furthermore, I do think that the Obama administration went too far by editing Hollande's speech. But in a way, I can appreciate the logic of it. It's a classic dog whistle to the Muslim community that this is a red line that Obama has drawn. And despite the pressure from the right and the rhetoric from the right, and even in circumstances such as these, he is not going to cross that red line. It's a way of signaling his goodwill and his intention to stay the course.
Rick?
Well, I guess I have several reactions. One, I would dispute that right-wing terrorists have had anything like the number of deaths. I mean, just 9/11 alone was more than all of the right-wing murders or violence or whatever you want to call it that we've seen in the last 15, 20 years. But that's a small point. The larger point is the lack of reaction amongst Muslim communities to these terrorist acts, both here and in Europe and elsewhere. In other words, supporting the national governments, supporting the victims, many times Christians, is appalling, disgraceful. The documented aid that Muslim communities have given to these terrorists, particularly in Europe, but also here, is appalling, disgraceful, and an order of magnitude worse than any danger of prejudice against Muslims that might arise. Okay, let's start from that premise. You would expect that there would be mullahs screaming from the rooftops, "Stop killing people." That is not what is happening. All right? There was a mullah in the UK who did that not too long ago, a couple of weeks ago, and he was murdered by Muslim terrorists. Okay? So I couldn't disagree more with the Orwellian, what is positively Orwellian response that the Obama administration has had or had to the Hollande speech. I say bravo, Francois. Tell them what's happening. Take a stand. Make very clear what your intolerance for this violence is, and name the source, because by implication, those who are aiding these Muslim terrorists, the other Muslims, particularly in France and elsewhere in Europe, need to be put on guard. They need to know that they will be thrown in jail, deported, whatever it takes to stop this violence.
Okay.
If I could just respond to that, do you really want to follow France's example? I mean, that doesn't seem like a recipe for success right now. That is a very large and very angry population of Muslims, and I think that we could do well in order to not have the same problems. Think a little bit about what France has done wrong, and you have identified a very real problem. We do rely on the Muslim communities in our countries to protect us, but the solution that you propose, putting them on guard, the state putting a minority on guard, a minority that has a lot to deal with as it is that really how you think they're going to get cooperation out of these people? The best way to do this is to make sure that we live up to our principles of treating these people as our fellow citizens. This it simply does not follow from what you say you want to do to go to the means that you're proposing.
Well, I humbly disagree. Look, we live under the rule of law, and France does as well. And if you break the law, whether that means you're committing an act of terrorism or abetting an act of terrorism simply by hiding the identity of a terrorist, in other words, you're an accomplice, you need to be punished. And the most extreme measures of the law should be applied so that people understand you don't do that anymore. It's that simple.
Stories in Europe do not come from places that treated their Muslim communities like a threat. They come from places like the town in Belgium that is being held up as the exact opposite of Molenbeek, where there have been community interventions led by the Islamic population itself that has excluded the police from the conversation. Those are the success stories. If you want to protect us, you have to stick with what works, what's been proven to work. And it just is really beyond me how you think that after all of the evidence against it, that wagging your finger and saying we're going to destroy you is going to help anything when it just hasn't done it yet. It's evidence-based thinking.
Yeah, but lives are at risk here, all right? Because of these accomplices in France, Belgium, and other places, more Europeans are going to die, all right? Unless these terrorists or potential terrorists or quasi-terrorists or accomplices are outed and punished. It's that simple. They have to be in jail.
No one wants people to die. No one wants we all share the same.
Liberals don't mind. Liberals don't care if people die. It's a small price to pay for fighting racism.
We happen to believe that it is a more effective way to combat terrorism to treat these people with dignity than to threaten them with the power of the state. And I believe we have evidence on our side. I mean, if you are right, why hasn't your strategy worked? And why is the United States, which is considerably more tolerant than these other countries and has a more integrated minority, relatively free of the terrorist acts that we've seen recently? Not entirely, obviously, but we haven't had anything like the magnitude of it. So
yeah, we don't have the numbers either. France has many millions as a percentage of the population. It's far greater than the United States. It's a multiple of what you find in the United States. So I think
there is a qualitative difference between the Muslim experience in the United States and the Muslim experience in France. I'm a French citizen, and I can say that with a high degree of concentration. I mean, just the fact that the second generation, the one that was actually born there, is the generation that has chosen to put on the hijab when their parents had sworn it off for themselves. That gives you a measure of the alienation that these people feel in French society. It is not the people who moved from Algeria, who are donning the hijab. It's the ones who feel they are lost in their own country that do it.
I'm going to interject here. I've got two other comments. One is perhaps the Muslims don't purposely integrate into the society because of their roots in Sharia law, and they don't want to. Maybe it's it is actually individual choice here that's really driving the individual terrorists to do as they will, and so and secondly, you've got you said something about Muslim dignity. Here they probably assimilate a little bit better because they don't have welfare as readily as they do in Europe. And when you have to work for a living, you don't have time to get mad at society and not integrate. You have to work and scrounge for your and do what everybody else has to do in getting a living together. And in Europe, the benefits are so easy that terrorism is quite easy. And also living separately is easy when you don't have to work. Go ahead.
Well, that's a bit of an interesting view of Europe's social problems. I mean, granted, unemployment is an issue over there, but unemployment has more to do with structural reforms to the labor markets than anything else, and also a chronic lack of growth, in large part driven by a lack of population growth. But the fact of the matter is that the generation that moved to France from northern Africa, largely from Algeria, they were brought over in the 1960s when there were not enough workers to produce the cars that Renault needed to produce, to build the buildings that were going to be the foundation of a new European economy after World War II. Well, when all of that ended in the 1970s and the age of economic expansion stopped, the generation that had come from Northern Africa ended up staying, and they ended up not well integrated into the society. That being said, they were a largely secular generation that had made a significant attempt to integrate. They left their countries for what was clearly a better life, and they were the classic immigrants that we think of in large part. And maybe not to the same degree as we would like them to be, but if you look at religious attendance, if you look to markers such as wearing of the hijab, there's a dramatic difference between the parents and the children on this.
Okay.
So it isn't simply coming from the religion itself. There must be another sociological factor.
Okay, Rick, you have the final word because we're a little short on time today. Go ahead.
Terrorism is growing. It's going to continue to grow. I think up until now, the response of the U.S. under this administration and in Europe, broadly speaking, particularly in Germany, has been soft. It will invite more terrorist attacks, and those will happen. And it's going to continue until there's a serious enough reaction so that new political leaders are put in place that treat this far more aggressively.
Okay, guys, I want to thank you for joining us, and this sounds like a topic that was going to require some further investigation and discussion. So we'll have some more of it. Thanks for joining us on the Philosophical Angle. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.